Hello YouTube, and hello Inspiring Philosophy, I believe your name. Someone pointed me to your videos, and I just watched the first one, What Atheists Confuse. And it's about 12 minutes long, and there are a whole lot of claims in this video. And I can't, hopefully, I obviously can't hope to unpack them all. It would be simply beyond the scope of a YouTube video. I'd have to make like a 40-minute video. But there are sort of primary claims that you make sort of right at the outset. So in some way this is going to be a response to the first 3 minutes of your video. First of all, you talk about the evidence for the existence of God. I think I'd object to the word evidence, and I think that you're using the word evidence in a slippery way. I don't think you bring up the fine-tuning of the universe and such like this. Those don't constitute evidence for the existence of God. Even if we accept that the universe is fine-tuned, the word evidence there simply doesn't belong in this context, right? You might say that it's a fact about the universe that might point to the existence of God. But evidence is by definition tied to a process of inquiry. And what you call natural theology, I'd prefer to just call it evidential apologetics, is not a process of inquiry. So slippery use of the word evidence. That's just a minor point, though. In other words, I would actually just challenge you to define what you mean when you use the word evidence. So that's what I want to say. Now, you identify an assumption, or what you call an assumption, right? And I think that this is the crux of everything that you're saying. You say if we don't have evidence for such a thing, then then we can conclude that it doesn't exist or something like that. The Huxleyan position, essentially. And you say that the assumption here is the only reason we should believe, this is a quote, the only reason we should believe something is true is if there's scientific proof of it. That is your identification of an assumption in there. But I don't think that anybody makes this assumption. I don't think that clearly this assumption would be insane. The claim, or the assumption that I think is actually being made, which is a methodological assumption, is that the only reason that we should believe that the existence of something is true is if there's scientific. You use the word proof of it. Proof is the word proof there, and you say it again later. Scientifically proven. The word proof is misapplied. Just by the way, inductive. You point out that science is inductive, which is essentially true. We don't use the word proof when we're talking about induction. So the only reason we should believe something is true is if there is scientific proof for it. No, again, the only reason we should believe that something exists is if there's, I would rather just say, good grounds to believe that it exists, right? It's very different than saying scientific proof and that something is true. I think, this mistake is I think the fundamental misstep in your video. And it's true. What you're proposing, right? This sort of naive pre-modern metaphysical approach about, how do we say if something is true? Well, we, build up an argument a priori. We apply a priori logic to the world, and then we come out with some conclusion, right? That doesn't work, right? This is something that sort of most philosophers understand. This is why natural philosophy doesn't exist anymore. This is why people don't do natural philosophy anymore. This is why the only place that you see quote-unquote philosophical arguments for the existence of something anymore are for the existence of God. Philosophers don't play this game anymore. Apologists play this game. People like William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga. This is apologetics. It's not philosophy. It would be smart not to confuse the two. We establish the existence of things through empirical means. That's what I would say. Now, you say that God is by definition not empirical, or by definition outside the natural world. Now, I would have to say that I would go with apophatic theologians here. And I would say that then, if it's the case that God exists outside the natural world, and if it's the case that God is, by definition, not empirically, you can't get there via empirical means, that means a couple things. First of all, if you can't get there via empirical means, then you can't point to things in the physical world and say that it constitutes evidence for it. And you point this out yourself. Shakespeare going up to the attic, this is the C.S. Lewis quote. Hamlet going up into the attic trying to find evidence of Shakespeare, right? This obviously wouldn't work, or it's an absurdity. In the same way, it effectively just doesn't work to look around. If God is you can't have it both ways, right? Either God is outside the empirical world and therefore cannot be established through empirical means, or we look at the evidence in the empirical world and then therefore can come to that conclusion, right? You can't do both of these. So there's a formal contradiction between the two. It's not just something that is easy to get around. And when you say outside the natural world, I think I mentioned, I'm sort of stumbling over my words and I apologize. I would follow apophatic theologians here. If we say outside the natural world, then the word existence no longer applies, right? So within apophatic theology, one of the more mystical statements that can be made is that God does not exist. What that means is that when we use this word existence, it refers to a certain set of, I don't want to say properties, but it refers to a certain ontological status that we encounter in the world, right? So, this thread exists, this pen exists, right? Now, if there is such a thing as God, it obviously does not have the same ontological status as that which we say exists, right? So as such, by your own logic, right, it doesn't actually make sense, right? It doesn't make sense to say, first of all, it doesn't make sense to say God exists. Second of all, it actually doesn't make sense to make any claims about God whatsoever, ever, right? God becomes something that is untouchable by language, by definition as well, which effectively means, and it brings you right next to my position, it effectively means that every statement ever made about God in language is false by definition. So as such, again, we can't make the claim God exists. The word existence is constricting on God. Now you bring up philosophy, history, and forensics, right, as three examples of things that you cannot use scientific methods to come to conclusions about. I think that this is crap. Within forensics, for instance, and within history too, we construct models and we make predictions on the basis of those models. So for instance, one famous example is, for the longest time we were working with the model that Troy did not exist. And then some guy found Troy, right? And therefore falsifying that model. So now we know that there is more substance to the Iliad than previously thought, right? So we construct a model. There's a condition of its falsification. It can be falsified, right? So while it might not be the same process as would be applied in chemistry, the essential workings of the scientific method can still function within history. History, I would say, perhaps less so. It's less compelling, but forensics, certainly. Like, forensics is a science, and it's absurd to say that it's not. And we don't really do this in philosophy either. This is, again, the difference between philosophy and apologetics. I would actually challenge you, right? I would challenge you to find me one example of somebody constructing something like the ontological argument, which I know you advance. Find me one example of somebody constructing that kind of argument for the existence of anything except God. Right. This is the point. The game that's being played here is not a philosophical game. The game that's being played here specifically belongs to apologetics. And since, the beginning of time, even deeply religious philosophers like one of my favorites, Kierkegaard compares apologetics to a prostitute trying to sell her charms to philosophy, right? Philosophers have looked down on apologists for a long time because of their, these silly methodological gestures, right? Philosophers don't try to prove existence claims. That's just simply not the business of what's happening. So yeah, I'm going to cut it there. That's the first 3 minutes of your video, and I could talk for just as long trying to sort out or pick apart the inconsistencies in the rest of it. But yeah, I hope you respond. I'm not trying to be rude, right? It's just I find your logic interesting in that it seems to me to be so incorrect. Seems to me, but please defend your case. Thank you very much, and have a good day.